Om Jnanatimirandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Jai Shriman Narayana. Very good. So, before we can even begin to ask such questions as what is the meaning of life, why are we here, is there a God, what is God's nature, what is the path that I am meant to follow in order to know myself and to know the Absolute. Before we can ask any of these questions, first we have to ask the fundamental question, how can I even know anything? Why even bother asking these questions unless I know what is the process of acquiring knowledge? In other words, is it possible to know any of these things, etc.? So as people know, this is something that I've written quite extensively about, spoken quite extensively about. This is what's called epistemology. That is, how is it that we derive knowledge as human beings, as perceptual beings? In our tradition, we understand that the way that we know X thing is through the very same means as that X thing. In other words, what is it that is the object of our pursuit? It is consciousness, really, stating it very, very generically. We are seeking ourselves in our ultimate essential self as Atman, that is consciousness. We are seeking God. We are seeking Brahman, who also is of the fundamental, essential nature of consciousness. Thus, how do we know that Absolute, which is consciousness? It is through consciousness. But more. That may sound logical, but how do we acquire even our own consciousness? You see, right now, of course, we are separated from our true self. Not in actuality, we are that true self. We can't really be separated, but our perception of that true self, that self-awareness in its highest state, Atma Bodhi, in its highest state, is something that we don't have access to at present because there is layer upon layer upon layer of illusion separating us from knowing that true self. Thus, before we can even come to that point of consciousness, knowing consciousness, first we must know our own consciousness, which right now we do not. Thus, we are in illusion. Thus, this is why we see people doing the things that they do in illusion, thinking that there are enemies around them, thinking that there is land to conquer, thinking that there is wealth that must be accumulated, etc., 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 thinking that the way that we have happiness is through greed, is through anger, is through lust, etc., etc., etc. This is Maya, this is illusion. Thus, how do we even come to this fundamental point of even knowing ourselves? What to speak of then knowing the divine? Well, this is where this fancy word epistemology comes in. The way in which we derive such knowledge is from the teachings of individuals who have achieved what we claim that we want to achieve. Very simple. And you've heard me give these many examples in the past. We want to become an MD. We want to become a surgeon. Okay? How do we do that? We go to a place where there are successful MDs, successful surgeons. What does that mean? We want to become a surgeon. Do we just pick up some books, having never studied anything having to do with medicine or physiology or anatomy or biology, pick up a bunch of books, kind of try to teach ourselves, and then try to experiment on our cat? We'll kill our cat. No. Do we go to barber school to learn to become a surgeon? No. Where do you go? You go to medical school. You go to a place where there are individuals who have achieved that which we claim we want. And I'm, as people know, I choose my words very carefully. What we claim we want. See, we can claim I want to be a surgeon. But if you truly want to be a surgeon, then you go to medical school. Again, you don't try to educate yourself. You don't try to go to barber school. You don't try to go to massage school. You don't try to go to this school or that school. You go to that place where there are individuals who have achieved exactly what you say you want and have done so very successfully, and who are gracious enough to now teach you. In the same way, how do we know that Absolute? The exact same process. using our sincerity, if it is sincerity, you see, then we will surrender to that which will provide us with what we claim we are seeking. That's how we know if we're truly sincere. We go to those individuals who have achieved what it is that we claim we want to have. Thus, I want to be spiritual. I want enlightenment. I want self-realization. I want to know who and what I truly am. I want to know why I am here. I want to know, is there a God? What is the nature of that God? Etc., etc., etc. 100 other questions, hundreds of other questions that we can ask. Now, how do we begin the process? We go to that realm, that place, that sector where there are those individuals who have achieved what we claim we are searching for. Now, this exists in two forms. It exists in the form of, quite literally, living individuals who have achieved that is self-realized, enlightened gurus who have indeed achieved that and who are alive here and now and today. Here and now and today. Or, if we have not yet encountered those individuals, where do we turn? To the writings of such individuals. And the writings of such individuals are known as Shastra. Shastra. Scriptures. What we call scriptures. Of course, when we translate this word Shastra in Western languages, whether it's English, French, German, etc., etc., there's always a problem because the translation is not quite as clean and sharp as it should be. When in English we hear the word scripture, we have one idea. I can tell you now that is not the idea that is being conveyed by this Sanskrit word Shastra. Shastra is an epistemic mechanism that is designed in order to deliver to us a direct experience that was experienced by previous yogis. That's what's meant by Shastra. That's what's meant by scripture. Now, what are these scriptures? Well, we know some of them. They are the Vedas, the four Vedas. They are the Upanishads. They are the Brahmanas. They are the Aranyakas. They are the Mahabharata, Ramayana, as part of the Mahabharata, Bhagavad Gita, and on and on and on like this. In addition to all this, we also have another set of scriptures known as the Sutras. The Sutras are scriptures that were written very specifically by rishis, by perfected beings. That's what a rishi is. In fact, a rishi is more than a perfected being. Is there something more perfect than perfect? Yes, there is. There are degrees of perfection. If there were not, then it would not be perfection. It would be something flat and vacuous. There are degrees of even perfection. That's hard for us to imagine. But this is how the spiritual realm works. Just like Dharma Raja and I, we get a kick all the time talking about how there are infinities, but then there are many infinities. And then there are qualitatively distinct infinities. Infinity is not infinity. In the same way, even spiritually speaking, there is no one such thing as perfection. There are perfections within perfections within perfections. So, when we speak about the rishis, we're talking about perfect beings. How's that? Perfect beings. These are beings who have achieved enlightenment, but more than this, they've done something that even most people who have achieved enlightenment can't do. And that is they become perfect via mediums for truth. They become beings who are like windows onto the spiritual world, who, when you look upon them, they have their own being as a window, but they serve a purpose. That purpose is that light can come through. That's a rishi. All right? Now, all this being the case, these rishis, what is amazing is these rishis have written works. One of these is the Narada Bhakti Sutras, the book that we are studying today. Okay? Now, why did I give all this background instead of just jumping into the scripture? Why? Why did I give all this background? Such that we can appreciate. So that we can appreciate. That's what you're going to say? Yeah. You're always right. You always get it. There are books written by this person, written by that person in the modern era, who are extremely imperfect beings who essentially are business people making a lot of money off of what they perceive to be a great public interest in spirituality. This is not who we're talking about when we talk about the authors of the scriptures. We're talking about beings who have so rid themselves, who have so made themselves devoid of all greed, of all anger, of all lust, of all illusory motivation whatsoever, to the point where indeed these beings are greater than the gods. This is why the gods offer their obeisances at their feet. And this is why when you meet such beings, they are called Deva. Thus, my guru, for example, his official name was Bhakti Rakshaka Sridhar Deva Goswami, meaning that he was above the gods. Why? Because the gods too have lust. The gods too have their problems. They are greater than us. But that being who is enlightened, someone like the Buddha, someone like a Jesus, is greater even than the gods. The only person greater than them is God. And they are God's servant. So this is why it's so important that we truly appreciate and respect these words. Now, of course, today you can go to any little bookstore, you can buy a translation of many of these scriptures. And as a result of the information explosion that we've had in the world, and especially the Western world in the last 20 years or so, where we have so many books, so many voices, so many, just a cacophony of so many different views and opinions coming toward us, we tend, unfortunately, to always forget to discern and to realize that the opinion of Joe Schmo down the street is not the same as the opinion of a Jesus, or the opinion of a Buddha, or the opinion of any other being who has so radically rid themselves of ego, has so radically rid themselves of that which is illusory, such that all that is left in them, besides their physical form, that they maintain as a courtesy to us, all that is left there is that purity of God's love. This is why when you encounter such a being, you know it. This is the author of the Narada Bhakti Sutras, is one such being, Narada Muni. Okay? Now let's begin. So we will continue with the 10th verse. Devotional absorption, ananyata, means giving up the shelter of all things that are not directly related to God. Ananyata, devotional absorption. This is the main theme that we find in the Narada Bhakti Sutras. This term, ananyata. And this is the best English translation that exists of this very, very difficult to understand Sanskrit term, ananyata. It's a yogic term. And what it means is absorption, but devotional absorption of one's consciousness in the Supreme. All right, so now with that understanding, let's go into this. So ananyata means giving up the shelter of all things that are not directly related to God. This verse alone we could probably, believe it or not, spend the next 2 hours talking about, because it's actually a much deeper verse than we would think. Because there are several things to have in consideration here. First of all, what it is saying is we, in our consciousness, should give up all those things that are not directly related to God. Now, this is the question. You see, it's begging a question. What is not related to God? Everything is. Really, everything is related to God. Isn't that the case? Because everything has God as its source. So in that sense, really everything is related to God. Now, as I say this, of course, without the proper deep understanding of what is meant by this, what is the mistake that people could make? They could make a nihilistic sort of mistake and think that that being the case, that, well, everything is related to God, so that being the case, what does that mean? That means that, well, I should just relate to everything. It means that there is no path. It means that there is no distinction. There is no no separation between that which should be done, that which should not be done, that which is the path, that which is not the path, which is not the path, etc. That's the logical conclusion that one would come to. But of course, no. Even though everything is related to God, there still is a hierarchy in relationship. In other words, some things are more related to God, some are less. But more, for our particular purposes, some things are designed to reveal God very specifically, much more so than other things are related to God. Let me give an example to explain the subtle differentiation and the importance of what's being said here. One could very easily say that, well, God is everywhere, right? So therefore, why should I go anywhere to know God? Why should anyone who's here today even be here right now? You could have stayed at home and been sitting in front of the TV, and is God not there? Is God not the source of your living room? Is God not the source of the TV? Thus, would it not be arguable that sitting at home watching a Huskers game is just as spiritual as being here and listening to something about the scriptures? Someone could say that, correct? Because after all, everything is related to God. Aren't the Huskers related to God? Now you see, people in front can't see, but a few people are kind of chuckling and smiling because you know that this is not the case. There is a hierarchy of being. There is a hierarchy of relationship. This is the example that's given and that my guru gave. Water is everywhere. Liquid, water, H2O, is everywhere. It's in the air right now. It's actually in these material objects. There is some liquid that is in this wood. There is some liquid that is in this wall. There is some liquid in this table. Water is everywhere, is it not? No, of course. When you're thirsty, are you going to lick the chair? Are you going to lick the wall? You see. Water is everywhere, but do you not go to that place where water is most concentrated such that you can have access to it? That's what we do. In the same way, is God not there in your living room as you are sitting and watching the Huskers game in your sweats? Of course. Are you going to know God by sitting in your living room in your sweats watching the Huskers game? I can almost guarantee no, you will not know God doing that. Because God is there, however, again, not everything is undifferentiated. On the contrary, everything is differentiated. The way that we know God is by going to those places, those people, those circumstances in which God is most overtly being exhibited and demonstrated and celebrated. Thus, this is why we're at a temple now, to know God, not at a bar, not at a Huskers game, not at a whatever else you can think of. Okay? So, at the same time, for an individual who indeed has achieved God consciousness, for an individual who has this ananyata, who has this devotional absorption, that is, their consciousness itself is absorbed devotionally in God. They are thinking of God. They are experiencing God 24 hours a day. For that person, do they truly see God everywhere? The answer is yes. The answer is yes. But you see, again, there are stages in development. Before we get to that point, let's not pretend we are at that point. You understand that? Before we get to that point, let's not pretend that we are at that point. You see, so many people, in order to cheat themselves and others, will use these arguments. Well, but God is everywhere. So, God is everywhere. So if I'm sitting at the bar, just on my fifth drink, God is in the drink. God is the cup. God is the bartender. God is here. In theory, yes. In actuality, you don't see God there. You're just using this as an excuse. Trust me, you don't see God there. You're just using this verbally as an excuse to be at the bar. So does it indeed get to the point where the enlightened being does indeed see God everywhere? Yes, but that is the final stage of enlightenment. Let's not pretend, let's not misuse the experiential state of enlightenment in order to keep ourselves from being enlightened. Does that make sense? Instead, what do? What is the path? We have the humility to understand, I'm not enlightened yet. Thus, what do? Let me not pretend that, oh yes, I see God everywhere, so therefore I have to do nothing. You see? You've known people like this, right? Oh yes, yes, I see God everywhere, therefore I have to do nothing. You see? Well, if you saw God everywhere, then that means that you already have had to have done something. You don't do nothing and see God everywhere. So, at the very beginning stages of spirituality, what do? We use discernment. We do indeed use the ability to see these distinctions. That yes, there are places where God is more present. Thus, let me do everything in my power to only associate with those things that are directly related to the divine in such a way that I personally, as a being presently in illusion, have upasana, have proximity to the divine in such a way that I become transformed. I've been using this word a lot more recently because it's a very advanced word and term, but now I think my disciples who have been with me for a long time especially can start to understand this. Upasana, very important Sanskrit word, not vipassana as in Buddhism, but upasana. Upasana means very simply proximity. We go to those places where there is most concentrated that which we want spiritually. What do we want spiritually? We want to know God. We want to know the divine. Any answer other than that is the wrong answer. It's the wrong answer. Even if we say, for example, what do I want out of spiritual? Oh, I want to have peace. That's a wrong answer. Wrong answer. Oh, I want wisdom. A wrong answer. Oh, I want some sort of mystic powers. Definitely the wrong answer. Why are these the wrong answer? Very simply because this is another example that my guru and other gurus would give. This is the example. You have a $10 problem. A problem which, if you had $10, you could solve that problem. You have a $15 problem. You have a $100 problem. You have a 50-cent problem. Okay? I've got a $25 problem. All right? You understand? So if I had $25, I could solve this problem, etc. Someone comes and gives you $1 million. Your $1 problem is solved. Your $25 problem is solved, etc., etc. In the same way, go first to that which is the source of all auspicious attributes. Go to that first which is the source of all that is good. Go to that which is the source of our very being. Go first to God. Go first to the divine. You'll have peace. You'll have wisdom. You'll have all the other things, the smaller things that you think you want. Guess what? You'll even have mystic powers. So this is why knowing the divine, Brahma Vidya, God consciousness, is the only answer for why we must practice spirituality. Everything else not only is secondary, everything else is so secondary that once we achieve the divine, we'll even have that without even striving for it. So this is why first we go to the divine. So the first stage is upasana. The first stage is proximity. That is seeking out all those things that are themselves divine. And in their company, being influenced by them, little by little, we transform ourselves in such a way that our illusory perception of reality starts to fade, and that true perception, that true darshana, that true vision of what is comes to the fore. This is why we do meditation. This is why we study the scriptures. This is why we seek out living masters. This is why we do puja. This is why we do anything that is spiritual in such a way as to inwardly transform ourselves. Thus, ananyata, devotional absorption, means giving up the shelter of all things that are not directly related to God. And then, of course, by inference, taking shelter in all those things directly related to God. Let's go on to the next verse, which is verse 11. To have indifference toward anything that stands in the way of devotional consciousness, bhakti, means to perform only those worldly activities and Vedic injunctions that are favorable to the cultivation of devotional consciousness, or bhakti. Now, interestingly, this is a longer, seemingly more complex verse that actually the purport of which is much simpler. And that is, all that this verse is saying is, live a life of simplicity, of healthy simplicity. You see, not poverty, not the idea of depriving yourself unnecessarily, but very simply, if we wish to progress spiritually, if we wish to thrive spiritually, then what this means is we mustn't live a life of material excess. Very simple. Very simple. And this is part of the sadhana. This is part of the spiritual practice. That what do we have in our life? Essentially, there is the spiritual and the material. There is the spiritual reality, but then there is the ever-present material reality, which is something that's very real. What does the material reality mean? The spiritual reality, we know. We can talk about that endlessly, and we have. But what does the material reality mean? Well, it means having to have a job. It means having to have an income. It means having to have some education. It means having to, if you have a family, take care of your family. It means having to take care of yourself physically, health-wise, having clothing on your back, etc., and a million other things that we can talk about. Having transportation in order to get to your job, in order to get to the grocery store, to get food to eat, and on and on and on. This is the material aspect of life. Now, for an individual who becomes a very serious spiritual practitioner, does this mean that they therefore focus only on the spiritual and give up the material, neglect the material 100%? Is that what this verse is saying? Of course not. Of course not. And in fact, on the contrary, those who are my disciples, who are initiated by me, can attest to this. When they come to me, even for spiritual reasons, and I see that materially they're not doing well, what's the first thing that I tell them? What's the first thing I tell them? Make sure you have a job. Do you have a place to live? Can you pay your rent? No. Don't worry about sitting down and meditating 8 hours a day, because you're going to be on the street very soon. Can you pay your rent? Can you pay your rent? Especially if you're a younger person. What kind of education do you have? Did you drop out of college, or did you begin college yet? Do you have plans for college? In fact, I tell them this so much so that very often it surprises them, actually. Very often I'll have especially younger people come to me thinking that because I am a yogi and a guru, that my advice to them is going to be, give up all material things and don't a job? No, that's illusion. No. They're always surprised, right? They're always surprised that they come to me and I tell them, number one, take care of yourself materially. Make sure that you have what you need. Because this is a very practical culture. This Vedic culture, Vedic spirituality is very practical. We are meant not to artificially neglect the material aspects of our lives, the things that we need, and to, in that way pretend that we're just 100% spiritual, while in actuality we're a starving homeless person. There's nothing spiritual about being a starving homeless person. Ask a starving homeless person someday. I've known many of them in New York, in Calcutta, many places. That's not what it means to be spiritual. What it means to be spiritual is to live a life of, what was the word I used before? What? Authenticity. Authenticity. It means to live a life of authenticity. And what does that mean? It means that you have the humility to understand that, yes, while I am a yogi and my goal is to know the divine, guess what? I also need to get a job like any other job in this world. It means I also have to do all the material things that everyone else needs to do, and I have to have the humility to understand that whatever is necessary is necessary. So, getting back to this verse now. Now, hopefully we're beginning to understand. you'll see that this verse is not telling us give up all material activity. But what is it saying in actuality? Yes, do what you need to, but live a life of simplicity. Live a life of simplicity. Have what you need. You don't need extravagance. You've got a nice car? All right. Do you really need to have a collection of 20 vintage cars, each of which is worth $200,000? Do you really need that? Really? When there are good people in the world who can't even afford a $500 car? Live a life in which we have all that we need, but still we have that simplicity such that we don't have extra baggage keeping us from growing spiritually. Okay? So very simple. Just a few more verses. And I think we're going to go a little bit quicker now with these verses. So this is now verse 12. Let one continue to be firmly fixed under the protection of the Shastra, the scriptures, even after he has established himself in devotional consciousness, in bhakti. Okay? Very interesting. Now, the Narada Bhakti Sutras, the entire point of the Narada Bhakti Sutras is bhakti, is devotion, devotional consciousness to God, to the Supreme. Devotional consciousness is both a path, it is a yoga, bhakti yoga, but more, one thing that makes bhakti different from any other yoga in existence is this. Every other yoga is a means. Think of any other yoga, jnana yoga, karma yoga, buddhi yoga, any other yoga that you can think of, raja yoga, ashtanga yoga, etc., etc., etc. Add any word that you want to in front of yoga. They're all simply a means, a way to achieve something. Bhakti is different from every other yoga on earth. This is why bhakti is the center of the Bhagavad Gita, among many other scriptures. See, this is not my opinion. Read the Bhagavad Gita someday and you'll see that all Krishna talks about is bhakti, 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 and the Bhagavad Gita is the most important yoga philosophical text on earth, more so than even the Yoga Sutras. Why is bhakti different? Because it is also a means. It is a way by which we know the divine, but it's also the goal. It's also the goal. Devotional consciousness. That is a consciousness, achieving a natural, innate state of consciousness, which is, again, inherent to our very being as consciousness, as Atman, in which all selfishness is absent. Any sense of selfishness is absent, and all that exists is devotion toward that which is our source. This is not only a means, it is a very state of consciousness itself. All right? So, with that understanding, now let's look at this verse. And let me read it one more time. Let one continue to be firmly fixed under the protection of the Shastra, of scriptures, even after he has established himself in bhakti, in devotional consciousness. This is an amazing statement if you understand this background to it. By devotional consciousness, what Narada is saying is, even after you have achieved the very highest enlightenment that is possible anywhere in material or spiritual existence, even then, you still have the scriptures as your guide. Again, not scriptures in the generic sense, Shastra, the utterances of the rishis, of the highest of enlightened beings. Why is this the case? And let me cut to the chase and give the profound answer. Because at that point, having achieved the highest enlightenment necessary, your very life itself is now non-different from the purport of those Shastras. Your very life itself is non-different and is indeed a very testament to those utterances of the rishis. Thus, how can you give them up? They are non-different now from you. In other words, you are now living the scriptures. To say that now that I've achieved enlightenment, I'm going to give up these utterances of the rishis is like saying, now that I've achieved enlightenment, I'm going to give up enlightenment. Nonsensical statement. Does that make sense? This is why a person who has this idea that the scriptures are, again, just some material tool Again, New Age people will say this. They say this about the Guru. They say this about everything. That, oh, once I've achieved enlightenment, oh yes, these things are of no importance anymore. If you say that, you haven't achieved enlightenment, because you don't understand that these were not just tools, they were windows to enlightenment. Thus, they were enlightenment. And now you've achieved that which the scriptures were showing you and which the scriptures were non-different from. So to say, I no longer need the scriptures, I no longer need the Guru, I no longer need this or that, having achieved enlightenment, is like saying, I no longer need enlightenment now that I've achieved enlightenment. All right? Very good. Very good. Let's go on to 13. And it's a continuation of the same thought. This is Sutra 13. Otherwise, without the protection of the scriptures, there is the risk of falling away from the path. Very good. Without the protection of the scriptures, there is the possibility of falling away from the path. This describes precisely the inauthentic, let's say, attitude of the person I was describing. The person who says, well, now that I've achieved enlightenment, I no longer need the scriptures. And how this is like saying, it's non-different from saying, now that I've achieved enlightenment, I no longer need enlightenment. Is it possible for an individual who has achieved enlightenment to fall away from the path? Let me state that very clearly, and please listen to the words very clearly. The word enlightenment is a generic word, is it not? And I'm using it generically. Is it possible for an individual who has achieved enlightenment to fall away from the path of enlightenment? Come on. Yeah. All right. Who else? No, it is. Again, that's why I stress generic enlightenment. Simply saying enlightenment, yes, an enlightened person can fall down. You see, an individual who has the highest enlightenment, who has entered Vaikuntha, never falls. One who achieves my domain, O son of Kunti, never comes back, never falls down again. So one who achieves the highest enlightenment, who quite literally achieves God consciousness, yes, that person never falls. But again, there are stages of enlightenment. So, even upon the lower stages of enlightenment, in order to keep ourselves from falling from the path, we still need that inspiration and more. Not just inspiration in the psychological or mental sense. We need that upasana, we need that proximity, we need that good influence of the utterings of the rishis in order to keep us on the path. It is like an invisible and yet detectable golden thread leading us along that path toward the divine. And as long as we can discern that golden thread leading us to the divine, we can know the divine. That's what that path is. So very important to take shelter of the scriptures. 14 now, and this I think is the last verse we'll talk about today. This is Sutra 14. To a similar extent and manner, social customs and worldly activities, as well as eating and so on, must also be continued for the full duration of the possession of one's body. So you see, this is kind of confirming what we talked about earlier, with this previous verse, talking about simplicity, how we have to take care of who and what we are materially. We have to have all the things that we need for sustenance, etc., but do so with simplicity. Now, interestingly, this last verse, this may seem so self-evident that it almost seems silly to even say this. Even if you've achieved enlightenment, keep eating as long as you have a body. That's almost silly to even say, isn't it? So why does Narada say this? Why does he end chapter 1? And this is the end of chapter 1. Why does he end chapter 1 with making what seems to be such a simplistic statement? Basically, again, he's saying, when you're on the path, when you're a yogi, even if you've achieved enlightenment, don't stop eating. Continue to take care of yourself. Continue to follow the Vedic injunctions continue to follow the customs of your society, continue to take care of all your material, physical needs, etc. Why does he say that?
Because many people try to drop out of the world completely as part of their spiritual endeavors. And then they crash land.
Very good. And then they crash land. Yeah, I would say not many, but some people will take the yogic lifestyle, will take spirituality to a crazy extreme. In America, we don't encounter people like this very, very often. Very rare. If you go to India, you'll see some people like this, who do indeed come to the point where their idea of spirituality is really self-abnegation. It's the idea of basically living a sort of life in which you're not living, to the point where they will quite literally try to stop eating altogether. And of course, they end up dying. What Narada is saying is, yes, don't live such an extreme lifestyle. Don't live a lifestyle of such rigid asceticism to the point where you begin to harm yourself physically. And again, for us in the West, we can't even conceive of what he's talking about. For people who have studied the history of yoga, we know what he's talking about. Or who know what some yogis are like in India, different places. But yes, there are some yogis who take things to the extreme where, oh my Lord, all they indeed do is meditate for 16 hours a day, and they don't eat, and they don't drink, and etc. And it comes to the point where they follow this so extremely that they die. There are some yogis who do this, and they think that this is a legitimate path. Interestingly, the scriptures teach against this. Narada, right here himself, said that this is not a path to follow. This idea of radical asceticism to the point where you harm yourself. We know that the Bhagavad Gita also, as a prime example, tells us that no, we are meant to do our duties within the world. We're meant to live in the world and do the things we have to, but at the same time, try to develop divine consciousness of God, while doing the things that we need to in this world. So in other words, true spirituality is a path of balance. Is it not? It should be. So this is why I always have to tell people again and again, people who have this kind of very fanatical, very rigid, very extreme sort of mindset, I have to tell them always again and again that no, the way that you grow spiritually is by having balance. I'm not going to use Arjuna as an example because he's wearing a very nice kurta, so don't look at Arjuna. Otherwise, everyone else in this room, how's everyone dressed besides me and Arjuna? Very normally, correct? Everyone's dressed very normally. I assume everyone is engaged in the world in one way or another, right? You have jobs, you're going to school, you have family, etc., etc. Yet at the same time, is not everyone here someone who is practicing spirituality and striving to know the truth? See, it doesn't have to be one or the other. It doesn't have to be one or the other. My job is to be an acharya. That's why I dress this way. Quite literally. This is my life. I do nothing else. This is what I do. So that's the only reason why I indeed dress this way. Otherwise, you'll notice that with my students, with my disciples, everyone lives a very normal lifestyle. In fact, I encourage them to. I encourage them to. See, that's the difference between a culture versus a cult. With a cult, no, everyone must dress like me, do like me. You should all move in, and we'll start to eat communally, etc., etc. I do the opposite. For those who have been my students for a long time, you will attest to this. I encourage people, please have a life in the world. Have your own place to live, have a job, etc., etc. But with everything that you do, try to incorporate spirituality in your life in any way that you can. That means even at your job. That means even when you're doing your job, try to think of God, try to think of Krishna. Try to think to yourself that, yes, I'm here doing my job, but at the same time, make it into a meditation where you're thinking to yourself that I am doing, but I am not doing just for a paycheck. I am doing in devotion to God, in devotion to the Lord. And in that way, yes, make your entire life into a meditation, but have a life. Have a life. You see? So this is ultimately what, with several of these last verses that we've looked at, what Narada is trying to inculcate in the reader is, yes, cultivate the highest form of consciousness imaginable, bhakti, devotional consciousness toward the Supreme. But at the same time, don't stop eating. Don't stop eating. Do the things you need to do in this world, and in that way have a balanced life, and in that way have the perfection of life, and in this way no joy and no happiness, and live at every moment as if you're in Vaikuntha, in the spiritual realm. Good? Very good. We'll stop there. Next time we get together, we'll start on chapter 2 of Narada Bhakti Sutras.
What is it that covers? Why is it that it is not still purpose?
Okay. No, that's a very good question. And I'll answer it by using your same analogy, actually. The lamp has been lit, but with the beginning stages of enlightenment, it can still be extinguished. With the highest stage of enlightenment, that is Brahma Vidya, what Vedanta describes as Brahma Vidya, that is God consciousness. At that point, God is the light. Cannot be extinguished. So that's just using the analogy, but now let me explain more philosophically. As spiritually existent beings, that is, as pure Atman, okay? As pure Atman, we have a purpose. There is nothing that does not. Actually, even God has a purpose. Everything has a purpose. Everything material has a purpose. But then, even spiritually speaking, the reason why Atmans exist is for a purpose. What is that purpose? That purpose exists outside of itself, ultimately. That's why there is a multiplicity of Atmans. This is getting a little deep, but if the Atman's purpose did not exist outside of itself, there would be no purpose for having a multiplicity of Atmans. There would be only one, you see. But the very fact that there is a multiplicity of Atmans shows that its purpose lies outside of itself. What is that purpose that lies outside of itself? To love others. To love our fellow Atmans, fellow spirits, fellow souls, and ultimately to love with devotion, with bhakti, the Supreme. You know, so this is the very purpose, the spiritual purpose of Atman. That being the case, with the very preliminary stages of enlightenment, Atman still is not fulfilling that inner purpose. That is, it knows itself. It has Atma Jnana, has Atma Bodhi. It has self-awareness and self-knowledge. It knows itself, self-realization. At that point, having self-realization, it has the ability to thoroughly distinguish between itself as consciousness and that which is not consciousness, that which is Prakriti. That is called enlightenment. That very fact itself, that ability to differentiate between self as consciousness, that which is not self as materiality, that is enlightenment. That is the most generic understanding of enlightenment, but more, that is only the very preliminary stage of enlightenment. Now, having achieved that, still, even in that enlightenment of Atma Jnana, true knowledge, still has the Atman fulfilled its actual purpose? It has not. Until it comes to the point of being able to love an other, the other, I should say. To love oneself, that's one thing, you see. That we have a copious amount of. Especially in the material world, it's illusory, but still, everyone loves themselves. The purpose of our soul is to love the other. That means other souls, but ultimately the divine. So it is not until we have achieved that actual inherent purpose of the Atman that the Atman has come to its own complete spiritual fulfillment. Now it's Atman truly operating as Atman, loving and loving and loving and loving. Does that make sense? And that is why it's crucial, and so few people, especially in the West, but so few people, even with a somewhat good yogic understanding, so few people get this, that there are two stages There's more, but two primary stages. There's Atma Jnana, self-realization, and then Brahma Vidya, God consciousness. And that they progress in that order. They must necessarily. They have to. But also that there is that distinction and what the distinction is. So this is why it's explained that, for example, a person can have Atma Jnana, self-realization, to the point where they even are liberated from this world, but they don't necessarily enter into the realm of pure devotion, Vaikuntha. Thus, they can still fall down. They can enter into what's called Brahma Jyoti, into the light of God, but they can still fall down. Why? Because they only have Atma Jnana, God consciousness. They understand, I'm not that. I'm not this. I am consciousness. That's good. But they're not fulfilling their purpose as Atman to love. At that point, they're in a higher realm of enlightenment, Vaikuntha. And from there, you never fall. In Vaikuntha, a leaf never even falls from a tree. No one falls from Vaikuntha, from the truly spiritual realm. Any other questions? Please.
It might be a bit of a tangent if it's too off topic you don't have to answer, but is there a spiritually healthy way to love oneself?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, definitely. Definitely. Of course, again, due to the just absolute copious amount of confusion that exists in the modern West, this concept of self-love is abused. And people mistake ego and selfishness for self-love. This is why it's a very tricky thing. Like, what was that song that Whitney Houston put out, the greatest love of all, like 25, 30 years ago? Do you know that song? The greatest love of all is to love me. Unfortunately, the danger with something like that is that, again, it can be misunderstood. And, people can think that what true self-love means is, well, me, the hell with you. That's not healthy self-love. What that is our disease. That's just egotism. That's just, a psychopathic, narcissistic egotism. That's not true self-love. What true self-love means is to, number one, know what is that self to love. What is it that you're loving when you say self-love? Are you loving your face? Are you loving just your body? Are you loving just your warped psychological construct that you think is yourself? What is that self to begin with that you are loving? That's number one, is understand yourself as consciousness. That being the case, more than a self-love, it's a self-respect. It is an honoring that true self as consciousness. That is actual healthy self-love. It's an honoring of oneself as what you truly are. That is spiritual self-love, as distinct from egotistical self-love. But yes, a healthy kind of spiritual self-love in that sense is absolutely something to be embraced. Does that make sense? Very good.
That is, how do you generate bhakti? I know how to do karma yoga, and the only reason I do karma yoga is because there's some bhakti in me, which is driving me towards the goal. But how does one enlarge and amplify your sense of bhakti?
While practicing the other yogas?
Can we give up the other yogas completely?
That's a very interesting question, actually. I'm glad you asked that. No one's asked me that before. And it is actually something very important to know. I'll try to state this as simply as I can. There is only one yoga, ultimately. The reason why traditionally there are different names for different aspects of yoga is so that the different aspects can at different points be accentuated in order to teach them more perfectly and more fully. Otherwise, truthfully, there is only one path of yoga. Today, of course, we give so much adherence and credence to the idea of, sectarianism. How many different religions are there? Tens of thousands. How many different yogas, etc., etc. The truth of the matter is, however, that at one point it was understood that there was only one yoga. There is the yoga system. And karma yoga is one aspect of it. When you didactically want to understand or teach that aspect of yoga. Jnana yoga is another aspect when you didactically want to understand or teach that aspect, and on and on. And then, of course, modern forms of yoga are not even yoga at all. They're just concoctions. So we're not talking about that. We're talking about yogas that are mentioned in the scriptures and traditionally taught and followed by the great yogis and acharyas. That's what we're talking about. Okay? So understanding that ultimately it's one yoga, the important thing is that bhakti permeates all of them. So this is why when you read the Bhagavad Gita, for example, you'll see that Krishna himself talks about these various yogas and he teaches them. He starts with Jnana Yoga in chapter 2. He teaches Jnana Yoga, then Karma Yoga, and Buddhi Yoga, Sannyasa Yoga, and on and on. Each one of the 18 chapters of Bhagavad Gita is a different yoga. But yet, what permeates throughout, from the beginning of Bhagavad Gita to the very end, it's bhakti, as, again, that golden thread. Remember I talked about the path being like a golden thread that is not visible to the eye, but is there and can be discerned nonetheless. Well, that golden thread is bhakti, according to Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. That being the case, we can practice all the other aspects of the yogas. The important thing is that with each of the yogas, our conscious awareness is involved. And not just involved, but involved in such a way that we make sure that our conscious awareness is permeating our yoga practice with that bhakti. What to speak of a form of yoga that focuses a little bit more on consciousness, like dhyana yoga, buddhi yoga, etc. Even asana. Asana is purely physical. Well, how can that be permeated with bhakti? Yet it can. The way we do upasana yoga, is it permeated with bhakti? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the whole point. Even as you're going physically from one asana to another, ideally I'm talking about, the idea is that as you're doing the asanas, your consciousness, your awareness is focused on the divine in such a way that even the asanas, one after the other, becomes a living meditation, but a devotional meditation. So that's physical, seemingly. So then what to speak of something more subtle like karma yoga or jnana yoga? So that's the thing. With all of the other individual aspects of yoga that we may be concentrating on at one time or another, permeated with bhakti. Consciously, willfully, using one's will. And that's the practice. That's the sadhana. You see. Really, in yoga practice, and I'm saying something now that probably no one has ever said for several hundred years, really, this is how we are to understand what is true yoga, is that it is ultimately permeated with bhakti. Any yoga that we are doing, including even asana, including sitting and meditating properly the way we teach, that is the authentic method, what do you see of a person externally? A person sitting there in complete stillness and silence. You see basically a statue, a living statue. Physically speaking, it would be like looking at a cup. That's what you see, but it's a person sitting there in complete stillness. What is actually happening? If it's pure meditation, in actuality, it's permeated with bhakti. Thus, this is why, again, bhakti is the essence of all. Bhakti is the essence of all yoga. Does that make sense? Yeah. So what is yoga? It is that with everything that you do, especially with overt yoga practice, but really, with everything that you do, have bhakti, have that devotional consciousness be at the center of all things. As you're brushing your teeth, as you're doing everything, as you're getting dressed in the morning, as you're walking to your car, as you're in your car turning it on, as you're driving to work, as you're at work, and you have your co-workers who are sometimes wonderful, sometimes they're horrible. As you have to leave work and you have to run to the grocery store to buy some food to prepare dinner, as you're cooking dinner, as you're now sitting down and you're eating your food, with everything that you're doing, even these material things, what to speak of doing puja, what to speak of doing asana, what to speak of doing your actual dhyana, sitting in meditation. With everything that you do, material and spiritual, bhakti is in the center. That is yoga, and nothing else is. Doing a perfect headstand with no bhakti, you're just an upside down, unrooted tree. But if bhakti is there, you can be brushing your teeth, and it is a spiritual activity. How's that?